The world had always been silent for Nora Shelby. Not the kind of silence most people understood. Not the hush of a library or the quiet of an empty room. This was total absolute, a silence so complete it had texture and weight pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She had been born into it 26 years ago in a hospital in Prescott, Arizona, and she would die in it however many years from now. And in between, she would navigate a world designed entirely for people who could hear it. She didn't mind, not really, not anymore. You couldn't miss what you'd never had, and Nora had never had sound. She'd never heard thunder or music or the particular way her mother's voice reportedly cracked when she cried, which was often and always about Nora as if deafness were a terminal diagnosis rather than a fact of life. What Nora minded was the way people looked at her, the pitying tilt of the head, the exaggerated mouth movements as though she were a dog being taught commands. The way cashiers would hand change to whoever stood beside her rather than to her directly as if deafness were contagious and proximity might spread it. She minded the assumptions that deaf meant dumb, that silence meant emptiness, that a woman who couldn't hear was somehow less than a woman who could. And then there was the leg. She had lost it at 19, a motorcycle accident on a two-lane highway outside Sedona. A tourist in a rented convertible had blown through a stop sign, and because Nora couldn't hear the horn that reportedly blared for a full 2 seconds before impact, she had taken the hit broadside. The doctors had saved her life, but not her left leg below the knee. The prosthetic was good modern titanium and carbon fiber, a marvel of engineering that cost more than she made in a year. But it was still a prosthetic. It still made her walk with a slight hitch, a rhythm that was almost but not quite natural, like a song with a skipped beat. Deaf and one-legged. In a world that already struggled to see her as fully human, these two facts had conspired to make her nearly invisible. Nearly, but not entirely. Because some people saw her clearly. Some people saw her the way a hawk sees a field mouse, with precision and intent and the cold calculation of a predator assessing prey. Nora didn't know this yet. Not on that Tuesday morning in late October, when she pushed open the back door of Maggie's roadside diner and stepped into the kitchen that smelled like bacon grease and strong coffee and something that, if pressed, she would have called home. Maggie Rourke was already there, of course. Maggie was always there. At 72, the woman ran the diner the way she'd run it for 40 years, with the stubborn efficiency of someone who'd buried a husband, survived a recession, and outlasted every chain restaurant that had tried to muscle into her territory along Route 66. Her husband, Frank, had bought the place with his savings after coming home from the service. He'd been dead 15 years now, buried in the Veterans Cemetery 20 miles south, but Maggie kept his photograph behind the register and his coffee mug on the shelf where he'd always left it, as if he might walk through the door any morning and ask for his usual. Maggie signed. She wasn't fluent, not by a long shot, but she'd learned enough to communicate with Nora. When she'd hired her 3 months ago, it was one of only 2 job interviews where no one had asked Nora if she could really work. Morning girl, Maggie signed, now her weathered hands moving with the careful deliberation of someone translating between languages in real time. Coffee's on. Table 6 needs clearing. Nora nodded, tied her apron, and got to work. The diner was quiet this early. A couple of regulars sat at the counter, retirees who came in every morning for eggs and conversation and the comfort of routine. Nora liked the morning shift. Fewer customers meant fewer opportunities for miscommunication, fewer moments of that particular humiliation that came when someone spoke to her back and then got angry when she didn't respond. She cleared table 6, wiped it down, refilled coffee for the regulars, with a smile that they returned with the easy warmth of people who'd gotten used to her. Then she went back to the kitchen to prep for the lunch crowd. It was 11:47 a.m. when the black Mercedes pulled into the parking lot. Nora noticed it through the kitchen window. Not because she was watching for it, but because a car like that didn't belong in a place like this. Maggie's diner sat on a stretch of Route 66 that time, had mostly forgotten 40 miles south of Flagstaff, surrounded by nothing but desert and sky, and the kind of emptiness that made some people feel free and others feel terrified. The regulars drove trucks and sedans and the occasional motorcycle. Nobody drove a Mercedes with tinted windows and vanity plates. 3 men got out. The first was tall, tanned, wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than Nora's annual rent. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no, or if he had, hadn't listened. The second was built like a wall, thick through the shoulders and neck, the kind of body that came from a gym membership and protein shakes, and maybe something less legal. The third was wiry, mean-eyed, the sort of man who looked like he'd been in too many fights and enjoyed every one of them. They came through the door, and Nora felt it, not heard it, felt it. The vibration of the door, the shift in air pressure, the subtle change in the room's energy that she'd learned to read the way hearing people read, tone of voice. Something was wrong. Something about these three men turned the air electric with a charge she recognized on a primal level. Danger. She picked up a glass of water and walked toward their table because that was her job, because she'd learned long ago that ignoring fear didn't make it go away, because if she flinched every time someone made her uncomfortable, she'd never leave her trailer. The tall man, the one in the expensive suit, was talking. Nora couldn't read his lips from the angle she approached, but she could see the two regulars at the counter watching with the careful stillnesses of rabbits who'd spotted a coyote. She set the glass of water on the table. The tall man looked at her. Looked through her really the way people often did, as if her deafness created a force field that made her less than real. He said something. She watched his lips move, but caught only fragments. Something about the menu. Something about service. She pulled out her notepad and pen and offered them with a practiced smile that said, "I'm deaf, please write your order," a routine she'd performed 1,000 times. Most people understood. Some even smiled back. This man did not smile. His face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition, followed by something else, something that Nora would later describe to Garrett as calculation, as if she had gone from being a person to being an object of interest in the space between heartbeats. He took the notepad, wrote nothing. Instead, he spoke again slowly this time, his lips forming words she could now read clearly. "I said, are you deaf or just stupid?" The two men behind him laughed. Nora saw their shoulders shake, saw the mean one's mouth stretch into a grin. She didn't need to hear the laughter to feel its cruelty. She kept her smile, pointed to her ear, shook her head, pointed to the notepad, the universal gesture. "Please, write it down." The man knocked the notepad from her hand. It happened fast. His arm swept across the table with a casual violence that was almost elegant, sending the notepad and pen and the glass of water flying. The water caught him on the sleeve of his suit, a small splash, barely a stain, but from the way his face contorted, you'd have thought she'd thrown acid. He stood, and then his hand connected with her face. The sound, had Nora been able to hear it, would have echoed off the diner's chrome walls like a gunshot. But she felt the explosion of pain across her cheekbone, felt the floor rush up to meet her as her prosthetic leg buckled, felt the glass she'd been carrying shatter around her into 1,000 pieces that bit into her palms. She hit the checkered linoleum hard. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. Her prosthetic twisted beneath her at an angle that sent shooting pain up through the socket where flesh met machine. Around her, broken glass glittered on the floor like scattered tears. She didn't scream. She couldn't. But her eyes screamed everything her voice could not. The man adjusted his jacket. Nora watched him from the floor, watched the casual way he smoothed his lapels, the way his two associates positioned themselves at the counter, and the kitchen door blocking exits with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. She tried to push herself up. Her prosthetic wouldn't cooperate, the socket loose, the alignment wrong. Her hands found broken glass and she pulled them back, bleeding. She began to sign frantic, automatic, the apologies that had been drilled into her since childhood. "Sorry, my fault, sorry, nobody understood, nobody ever understood." Then the door opened again. She felt it before she saw it, a vibration through the floor so deep and steady, it was almost geological, like the earth itself was humming. And then the light from the doorway was blocked by shapes broad-shouldered, leather-clad, filling the entrance, the way boulders fill a riverbed. 6 men, 6 motorcycles still rumbling in the parking lot, their engines sending tremors through the diner's foundation. The man in front was tall, 6'2", with silver-gray hair past his collar and a beard the color of winter ash. A scar ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, an old wound healed crooked, giving him a permanent expression of controlled menace. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter sky, and they swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a man trained to assess threats in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His name was Garrett Howland. Most people called him by his road name, Ironhide. He was 64 years old, Behind him stood 5 more men, each wearing a leather vest adorned with the same insignia, a skull with wings, the Hells Angels, Arizona chapter. None of them were young. The youngest was 52, but age had not diminished them. It had refined them the way desert wind refines stone, stripping away everything soft, leaving only the hard truth beneath. Garrett's eyes found the scene. The girl on the floor, the blood, the broken glass, the 3 men in suits who didn't belong in a place like this. The expensive shoes planted inches from the girl's outstretched hand. Something in his chest tightened. A familiar pain, old and deep, like a wound that never healed. For one fractured moment, the girl on the floor wasn't a stranger. She was someone else. Someone from another time, another failure. He pushed the memory down. Maggie, Garrett said, his voice low and rough like gravel under tires. Looks like you got some trouble here. Maggie Rourke emerged from behind the counter, relief flooding her face. Garrett, these gentlemen were just... These gentlemen, the tall man in the suit interrupted, turning to face the bikers with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, are just leaving. But first, I think your establishment owes me an apology. And a new suit. He gestured to the water stain on his sleeve. This is Tom Ford, $3,000. Garrett took a step forward. Just one. But it changed the geometry of the room the way a single stone changes the course of a river. I think he said quietly, you better apologize to the girl you just hit. The man's smile widened. Or what old man you and your geriatric biker gang going to make me? The diner went silent. Even the regulars at the counter held their breath. Garrett didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked past the man, his boots crunching on broken glass, and knelt beside Nora. His knees protested. 64 years of hard living had a way of catching up. But he didn't let it show. Up close, he could see that she was trembling. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her right hand moved in rapid signs, the same frantic apologies she'd been signing since she hit the floor. Please help me. Don't trust them. Garrett's hands moved in response. Slower, more deliberate, but clear. I understand. You're safe now. Nora's eyes went wide. In 26 years of living in a hearing world, she could count on one hand the number of strangers who'd spoken her language. And now this grizzled biker, this intimidating stranger with a scar down his face and eyes, like winter, was signing to her as naturally as breathing. How she signed. Later, Garrett replied. Then out loud, can you stand? He helped her to her feet, steadying her when the prosthetic threatened to buckle. Around her neck, she wore a small silver pendant, a dog running free. Garrett's breath caught. His son Declan had worn an identical pendant, a gift from his best friend who'd lost his hearing in a childhood accident. The coincidences in life had a way of cutting deeper than any knife. Once Nora was steady, Garrett turned back to the man in the suit. The other 5 bikers had fanned out behind him. Not threatening, not advancing, just present, solid as mountains, impossible to ignore. Now Garrett said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. About that apology. The man's composure cracked just slightly. He glanced at his 2 associates, then back at the wall of leather and gray hair blocking his path. He was a man used to money and influence, smoothing every rough edge. But money meant nothing here in this roadside diner in the middle of nowhere, with 6 hard men who looked like they'd forgotten how to be intimidated somewhere around 1975. You don't know who you're messing with, the man said, his voice harder now, the polite veneer dropping away. I could buy this diner and bulldoze it before sunset. I could make life very difficult for all of you. Son, said the massive biker standing to Garrett's right, a man they called Tank, whose real name was Randall Odom. We're all over 60. We got bad knees, worse backs, and most of us wake up 3 times a night to piss. Life's already difficult. The other bikers chuckled low, rough sounds. The man's face flushed. You think this is funny? No, Garrett said. I think you hit a young woman because she spilled some water. I think that makes you a coward and a bully. And I think you're going to apologize to her right now, or you're going to find out just how difficult life can get. The tension was thick enough to chew. Nobody moved. Then the man reached into his jacket. Every biker's hand moved simultaneously. Not to weapons, not yet, but to ready positions. Men who'd learned to read violence in the fractional second before it arrived. But the man pulled out a badge. Not a gun, FBI, special agent, the real deal. I'm a federal agent, he said, his voice cold now. All pretense of civility gone. And you just threatened a federal officer. That's a felony. Garrett studied the badge. It looked legitimate. The number was right. The seal was perfect. But something about it felt wrong. The way meat smells wrong just before you realize it's spoiled. A federal agent who slaps waitresses, Garrett said. Times sure have changed. She assaulted me first, threw water on me. I was defending myself. The man's smile returned sharp as a razor. And if you touch me, if any of you so much as breathe on me wrong, I'll have you all in federal prison before the sun sets. See how tough you feel when you're 70 years old dying in a cell. It was a bluff. Garrett knew it was a bluff, but it was a good one backed by a badge that gave it just enough credibility to create doubt. Behind the counter, Maggie's face had gone pale. She'd lived through enough trouble to know when to back down. Garrett, she said softly, maybe we should. It's fine, Maggie. Garrett held up a hand. The gentleman is leaving. Aren't you? The man straightened his jacket, his smile victorious. That's right, we're leaving. But first, he turned to Nora, who'd shrunk back against the counter. I'll be seeing you again, sweetheart. And then, as if to prove he knew exactly what he was doing, he signed in ASL, crude, simple, but unmistakable. Soon. Very soon. Nora's face went white. Garrett caught the signs. Caught the girl's reaction. Caught the way the man's eyes lingered on Nora, assessing her like merchandise, like property to be acquired. Every instinct Garrett had honed over 40 years screamed danger. But the man was already walking toward the door, his associates falling in behind him. At the threshold, he paused. Nice bikes, real classics. Be a shame if something happened to them. He tossed a business card on the nearest table. When you're ready to apologize, and you will be, you can reach me at that number. Then they were gone. The black Mercedes pulled onto Route 66 and disappeared east, back toward Flagstaff. Vanity plates NMX 4782. Garrett picked up the card. Embossed gold lettering. Dominic Crane, CEO Crane Corp. Real Estate Holdings. Real estate, muttered Earl Dawson, a man they called Sledge, built like a fire hydrant with a braided beard. Sure, and I'm the Queen of England. Garrett pocketed the card, then turned to Nora. She'd slid down to the floor again, hugging her knees, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. Garrett knelt beside her, ignoring the protest from his joints, and signed. Are you hurt? Do you need a doctor? Nora shook her head. Then her hands moved fast and desperate. They've been watching me. 3 days. Different cars, but always them. I tried to tell the police. They said I was paranoid. I'm not crazy. I'm not. I believe you, Garrett signed. Did they say what they wanted? Her hands trembled. No, but the way they look at me, like I'm not a person, like I'm merchandise, right? Garrett's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before in places most Americans only knew from news reports. Desert outposts where human life was measured in dollars and cents, where women and children became commodities. He'd fought against that evil once in a war most people had forgotten. And he'd sworn when he came home that he'd never turn away from it again. Garrett, Maggie said, approaching cautiously. What are you thinking? What was he thinking? He was thinking about Declan, his son, 28 years old when he put his father's service pistol in his mouth. 3 phone calls in the final 2 weeks unanswered because Garrett was busy running the way he'd been running since Kuwait. He'd meant to call back. He always meant to call back. But one day became 2, became a week, became a call from a Marine Corps chaplain whose voice was carefully neutral as he delivered the news that shattered what remained of Garrett Howland's world. I'm sorry, Mr. Howland. Your son is dead. He was thinking about that, about all the times he'd turned away, all the times he'd chosen the easy path, all the times he'd said, not my problem, and let someone else carry the weight. He was thinking that he was 64 years old with a bad back and worse memories living alone in a cabin because everyone he'd ever loved had either left or died. And he was thinking that none of that mattered. Not anymore. I'm thinking, Garrett said, slowly rising to his feet, that we're not leaving this girl alone. 48 hours earlier, the nightmare had started the same way it always did. Desert sands stretching to infinity under a sky so blue it hurt. The air shimmering with heat thick enough to choke on. The smell of burning rubber and diesel fuel mixed with something else. Something copper and wrong. The Humvee was on its side. Smoke poured from the engine. Flames licked at the undercarriage, small at first, then growing. Hungry. Inside, men were screaming. In the dream, Garrett ran toward the vehicle, his boots sinking in sand that seemed determined to hold him back. Faces through the shattered windows. Johnson, Martinez, Collins, Henderson. Boys, really. None of them older than 25. He reached the Humvee. His hands found the door handle burning hot even through gloves. He pulled, muscles screaming, until the door came free. Johnson first, then Martinez. Collins crawled out on his own leg, twisted wrong, but alive. But Henderson. Henderson was pinned beneath the steering column. The flames were growing, and Henderson's eyes met Garrett's through the smoke. "Don't leave me. Please, Sarge. Don't leave me. I won't." Garrett had promised, "I swear." But the flames reached the fuel tank, and the world turned white. And Henderson's screaming filled the universe, and it never stopped. Not really, not in 35 years, not in the waking hours when Garrett could distract himself, and certainly not in the dreams where distraction was impossible and memory ruled like a tyrant. Garrett jerked awake, 4:47 a.m. The cabin bedroom materialized around him. Rough pine walls, a single window showing pre-dawn darkness, sweat-soaked sheets. Henderson had died in 1991. Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm. A war that lasted 6 weeks and ended in victory parades and a grateful nation. But Henderson was still dead, and Garrett still dreamed about him every third night, like clockwork, like a debt that could never be paid. He didn't try to go back to sleep. He never could. Instead, he swung his legs out of bed, feeling every one of his 64 years, and padded barefoot to the bathroom. The face in the mirror looked like a stranger wearing his skin. Silver hair, deep lines around the eyes. The scar down his cheek, a gift from a bar fight in Albuquerque, 1998, when he'd been young enough to think violence solved things, and old enough to know it didn't, and drunk enough not to care. He made coffee, strong and black, the way he'd learned in the Army when sugar and cream were luxuries you couldn't count on. While it brewed, he did what he did every morning, checked his Harley. Outside, the desert was beginning to lighten, the stars fading as the sun prepared to announce itself. This was Garrett's favorite time of day, when the world was quiet and still, when he could pretend just for a moment that he was the only person left alive. The silence wasn't loneliness at this hour. It was peace, or something close enough to peace that a man who'd forgotten the real thing could still recognize its shadow. The Harley was perfect as always. A 2012 Road King black and chrome, maintained with the kind of obsessive care most men reserve for their firstborn children. He'd rebuilt the engine himself last winter, spending 3 months in the coal garage, his hands cramped and aching, losing himself in the mechanical meditation of disassembly and reconstruction. Earl had called him crazy, spending that kind of time on a bike that already ran fine. But Earl didn't understand. The bike wasn't the point. The work was the point. The focus, the way it filled his mind and left no room for memories, for regrets, for the faces of dead boys who trusted him to bring them home. Back inside, coffee poured and steaming, Garrett settled into his routine. Breakfast, 2 eggs toast, bacon. The same breakfast he'd eaten for 40 years, a soldier's habit that had outlived the soldier. Then the ritual he never skipped, even though it hurt every single time. He cleaned his pistol. The Colt 1911 had been issued to him in 1989 when he'd first deployed to the Gulf. Technically, he should have turned it in when he mustered out. But the Army had a way of losing track of things in the chaos of demobilization, and somehow this particular sidearm had made its way home in Garrett's duffel bag. He'd never fired it since Kuwait, not in 35 years. But every morning he field stripped it, cleaned every component, oiled the action, and reassembled it with the kind of muscle memory that transcended thought. The weapon was ready, always ready, for what he couldn't say, but ready. The cabin was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, a main room that served as everything else. Through the window, the Harley sat in the carport like a promise waiting to be kept. On the wall above the couch, a shadow box held his military decorations. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, ribbons whose meanings most civilians wouldn't recognize, and a photograph, a unit photo from Kuwait, 20 young men in desert camouflage squinting into the sun, every one of them certain they'd live forever. 6 of them hadn't come home. Henderson, Williams, Kowalski. 3 others whose names Garrett whispered to himself, sometimes afraid he might forget. Next to the shadow box, another photograph. A young man in Marine Corps dress blues, His face so much like Garrett's at that age it was painful to look at. Declan Howland, first lieutenant, born 1992, died 2020, 28 years old. The VA had sent a form letter. Counseling services are available. The Marine Corps had called it a tragedy. The coroner had ruled it suicide. None of them had asked the question that kept Garrett awake. Could I have stopped it? He turned away from the photograph. Some mornings looking at Declan's face was like staring at the sun. His phone buzzed. A text from Earl. Chapter meeting. Noon. Garage. Mandatory. He texted back, I'll be there. The Hells Angels garage sat on the outskirts of Flagstaff, a low cinder block building with a corrugated metal roof and more bikes parked outside than most motorcycle dealerships. The Arizona chapter wasn't as large as some 30 members total compared to hundreds in California or Texas, but what they lacked in numbers they made up for in loyalty. These were men who'd known each other for decades, who'd ridden together through divorces and deaths, through good times and catastrophically bad ones, who'd pulled each other out of ditches, literal and metaphorical, more times than anyone could count. When Garrett pulled up, 5 bikes were already there. He recognized them all. Earl's custom chopper, stripped down and mean. Virgil's Road Glide, a machine as lean and efficient as the man who rode it. Hank's touring bike, loaded with enough gadgets to launch a satellite. Clayton's vintage Sportster, lovingly restored. And Randall's massive Road King, the only bike in the state big enough to carry him comfortably. Inside the garage smelled like motor oil and old leather, with an undertone of stale beer and tobacco. The 5 men were gathered around a battered wooden table that had seen better days sometime during the Nixon administration. Earl Dawson's sledge looked up as Garrett entered. At 58, Earl was built like his nickname suggested, short, stocky arms, like tree trunks from 30 years of wrenching on bikes and brawling in bars. His beard was mostly gray now, braided into 2 thick ropes that hung past his chest. He was the chapter's vice president, the man who handled the logistics and the planning, while Garrett handled the leading. They'd been riding together for 22 years, long enough that they could finish each other's sentences and predict each other's bad decisions. About time, Earl said, but there was no heat in it. Thought we'd start without you. The others were already settled in. Virgil Knox sat in the corner, whipcord thin, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. At 61, he was the oldest among them, besides Garrett. He rarely spoke in meetings, preferring to watch and listen, but when he did speak, people paid attention, because Virgil Knox had never said a pointless thing in his life. Hank Prescott Bulldog sat beside Virgil. At 59, he'd been a cop for 25 years before he retired, had seen enough of the world's worst to know that justice was a word people used when what they really meant was compromise. He was the group's voice of reason, the man who asked the questions nobody else wanted to ask, and usually the last one to agree to anything reckless. Which meant when he did agree, you knew it was the right call. Clayton Evers' matchstick at 52 was the youngest, which meant he got stuck with most of the grunt work and caught most of the jokes. He'd been Army demolitions before a dishonorable discharge that he never talked about and nobody asked about because some stories weren't meant to be told. He grinned more than any of them, a defense mechanism that fooled strangers, but not his brothers. And Randall Odom Tank. 60 years old, built like a refrigerator, with hands that could crush a beer can or suture a wound with equal precision. He'd been a combat medic, came home with a Purple Heart and a morphine addiction he had finally kicked in 1985. Now he volunteered at the VA hospital 3 days a week, holding the hands of dying men who reminded him of the boys he couldn't save decades ago. The meeting was routine, the annual Toys for Tots run, Phoenix to Tucson, hitting children's hospitals along the way. Despite their reputation, the Hells Angels had supported the program for decades. Something about the holidays brought out the softness these hard men kept buried. We're leaving Friday day after tomorrow, Earl said. Scenic route, stopping at Maggie's place on 66. Count me in, Garrett said. Simple as that. The meeting dissolved into banter. Garrett was halfway to his bike when his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Yeah, he said. Silence, then breathing. Someone on the line, but not speaking. Hello, who is this? More silence, then a voice, distorted, mechanical, filtered through something electronic. Garrett Howland, we know what you did in Kuwait. We know about Henderson. Stay out of things that don't concern you. The line went dead. Garrett stood in the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, pulse hammering. Henderson, they'd said Henderson's name. That name wasn't in any public record. The official report had redacted casualties listing them only by serial number. Someone had access to classified military records. Someone knew which ghost would hurt him most. Someone wanted him scared. He memorized the number knowing it would be a burner. Then he texted Earl, "Need you to run a license plate. NMX 4782, don't ask why." Earl's reply came 30 seconds later. "You got it, brother. Give me an hour." The call came at 2 in the morning. Garrett grabbed the phone on the second ring. "Garrett, it's Earl." A pause. "You're not going to like this. Tell me." That plate, NMX 4782, registered to a shell corporation. Crane Corp Holdings. Took some digging, but the man behind it is Dominic Crane, real estate developer. Big money, real big. Earl's voice dropped. "But here's the thing, brother. I got a buddy in casino security in Vegas. He ran the name through some databases he's not supposed to access. FBI's been watching this guy 18 months. Suspected human trafficking, specifically targeting women with disabilities. Makes them disappear across the Mexican border. They think he's moved at least 20 women in 3 years." Garrett's grip tightened on the phone. "FBI's watching him and he's still operating, can't prove it. Guy's connected. State senators, federal judges, half the police force in Phoenix on his payroll. Every time they get close evidence, disappears. Witnesses recant, like he's untouchable." "Nobody's untouchable," Garrett Earl said carefully. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. This ain't our fight. We do the Toys for Tots run. We go home. We live our lives. That's it. Thanks for the information, Earl." "Garrett, I mean it. Let the FBI handle it." Garrett hung up. He sat in the darkness for a long time. Then he dialed a number he hadn't called in 6 years. "Do you know what time it is?" Dalton Garrett said. "I need a favor." A long silence. Then, "Jesus Christ, Garrett Howland, I thought you were dead." "Not yet. Dominic Crane, tell me about him." Dalton Mercer had been FBI for 30 years before retirement. He and Garrett had served together in Desert Storm. They'd stayed friends through the decades, drifted apart after Declan's death. When Garrett stopped returning, calls stopped being someone you could count on. "How the hell do you know that name? Is it true human trafficking, Garrett? This is an active investigation." "Is it true, Asai? The Creek of Bed Springs?" "Yeah, it's true. We've been trying to nail this son of a bitch for 2 years. But he's smart. Only goes after women nobody will miss. Homeless, addicts, women with disabilities whose families have given up. They disappear and nobody looks. What does he do with them? Sells them Mexico, Central America, sometimes as far as Southeast Asia. The disability angle is new. Apparently there's a market for it overseas. Makes me sick saying it out loud. Can you stop him? Every time we get close, the case falls apart. Witnesses vanish. Evidence gets contaminated. We think he's got people inside law enforcement, maybe inside the Bureau, until we can build a case that sticks." Dalton trailed off. "Why are you asking?" He tried to grab someone. A waitress, young woman deaf, prosthetic leg, slapped her around in a diner yesterday. Silence. Then Garrett, "Listen to me. Do not get involved. Crane is dangerous. Money connections a body count. You go after him, you end up dead or in prison. So I just let him take her. Call local police, file a report. Let us do our jobs. Your job," Garrett said, "has been trying and failing for 2 years. What are you going to do? Storm his compound with your biker buddies? You're 64 years old. You're not a soldier anymore. You're just a man with bad knees and worse judgment. Thanks for the information, Dalton." "Garrett, don't you dare." He hung up. Outside, the first light of dawn was creeping across the desert. Somewhere to the east, Dominic Crane was waking up in a mansion paid for with the lives of women nobody would miss. And 40 miles south in a diner on Route 66, Nora Shelby was getting ready for another day of work, not knowing that the man who'd hit her was planning to come back. Not knowing that her life was measured now in days, maybe hours. But Garrett knew. And for the first time in 8 years, since the phone call from the chaplain, since the funeral where he'd stood alone, because he'd pushed everyone away, since the endless procession of empty days and haunted nights, Garrett Howland had a reason to stop running. Not a good reason. Not a smart reason. The kind of reason that got old men killed and their friends arrested and their names added to the long list of fools who thought they could fight the world and win. But a reason And at 64 with bad knees and worse memories in a cabin full of ghosts, a reason was enough. He picked up his phone, texted Earl. Change of plans. We leave today. Not tomorrow. We stop at Maggie's. And we don't leave until that girl is safe. Earl's reply came fast. Brother, you sure about this? Garrett looked at the photograph of Declan in his dress blues, 28 years old, alive, still believing his father would answer the phone. I'm sure. They rolled out at 7. 6 Harleys in formation, engines rumbling like distant thunder. The desert morning was cool, the sky impossibly wide, the road stretching ahead like a promise or a threat depending on how you looked at it. Garrett led as he always did. Earl rode his right flank, Virgil Knox his left. Behind them, Hank Prescott, Clayton Evers, and Randall Odom formed the rear V, each man exactly where he belonged, a formation practiced so many times it was instinct. They reached Maggie's at 8:15. The parking lot was empty except for Maggie's pickup and a small Honda Civic. Inside, Maggie looked up from the counter. Well, well. You boys are early this year. Change of plans, Garrett said. Is Nora working today? The smile faltered. She's in the back, hasn't said more than 2 words all morning. What happened yesterday really shook her up. Can I talk to her? Maggie studied him with eyes that had seen plenty of men make plenty of promises. But whatever she found in his face satisfied her. She nodded. Let me get her. Nora emerged from the kitchen a minute later, moving carefully on her prosthetic. She covered the bruise with makeup, but it was still visible beneath the foundation. When she saw Garrett, her eyes went wide. He signed, "Can we talk?" She led him to a booth in the corner. Her hands moved quickly, nervously. You came back. Why, to help you. To keep you safe. You don't understand. That man Crane, he's rich. Powerful. He's been following me for days. Different cars, different times, always watching. I went to the police and they laughed at me. You're not paranoid. He's a predator. And he's done this before. What do you mean, other women? At least 20. Women like you, vulnerable, isolated. He sells them across the border. Her hands stopped moving. For a long moment she stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. Then why me? Because you're perfect for what he does. Deaf. Prosthetic. If you disappeared, who would notice? The tears spilled over. My brother died 4 years ago. Car accident. He was the only family I had. Everyone else gave up on me a long time ago. Too much work. Too much trouble. Garrett reached across the table and took her hand. His signs were slower but clear. You're not alone anymore. We're going to protect you. Why? You don't even know me. No, but I had a son, Declan. He needed help and I wasn't there. He died alone thinking nobody cared. I won't let that happen to you, Nora wiped her eyes. What can you do? He's FBI. You saw the badge. The badge is real. The man is dirty, and we're going to prove it. How Garrett paused, studying this young woman across from him, this stranger who'd been dropped into his life like a grenade. She was scared. She had every right to be. But beneath the fear, he saw something else, the same stubborn refusal to break that he'd seen in soldiers and survivors, in people who'd been knocked down so many times that getting back up had become a reflex rather than a choice. We make him come after you again, Garrett signed in, but this time we'll be ready. Nora's hands trembled, but she didn't shake her head. She didn't sign no. Instead, she signed something that surprised him. I'm tired of running. I've been running my whole life. From pity, from people who see my leg and my silence and decide I'm broken. From men like him who think I'm easy prey. She straightened in the booth. Her eyes dried, her jaw set. If you're asking me to stand and fight, I'll stand. But I'm not bait. I'm not a victim you're rescuing. I'm part of this. Whatever you're planning, I'm part of it. Garrett looked at her for a long time, saw his son's stubbornness reflected back at him, saw something that might have been courage or might have been desperation, though in his experience, the two were often the same thing. Deal, he signed. Nora nodded once. Then she stood, smoothed her apron, and went back to work. Because the lunch crowd was coming, and the coffee wasn't going to pour itself, and whatever war was coming would have to wait until after the dinner rush. Garrett watched her go. Then he turned to the 5 men sitting at the counter, watching him with the knowing patience of men who'd already made up their minds. Well, Earl said, we're staying, Garrett told them, all of us, until this is over. How long? Clayton asked. As long as it takes, Randall flexed his wounded shoulder and winced. My wife's going to kill me. Virgil smiled his thin, sharp smile. Better her than Crane. They laughed, all of them, the way soldiers laugh before a battle. Not because anything was funny, but because laughing was better than the alternative. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher. The heat built. Route 66 stretched east and west, carrying ordinary people to ordinary destinations. None of them aware that in a roadside diner with checkered floors and chrome walls, 6 old men and 1 young woman were preparing for a war that would change all of their lives. Or end them. Either way, there was no going back. Garrett Howland had spent 8 years running from his son's ghost. But ghosts, he was learning, don't want you to run. They want you to stand. The first night, nothing happened. Clayton Evers and Hank Prescott took the opening watch, parking their bikes a quarter-mile from Nora's trailer and hiking in on foot through the scrub brush and creosote that covered the desert floor like a threadbare carpet. They found positions on a low ridge overlooking the trailer, a battered single wide that sat alone at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by nothing but cactus and sky, and the vast indifference of the Arizona desert. The trailer was small, maybe 40 feet long, its aluminum skin dulled by years of sun and sand. A set of wooden steps led to the front door. A clothesline stretched between 2 posts empty. A potted cactus sat on the window ledge, the only decoration visible from outside. It was the home of someone who owned very little and expected even less. Inside, a light burned. Nora's silhouette moved behind thin curtains, and then the light went out, and the desert reclaimed its darkness. Clayton and Hank settled in. They'd brought water jerky binoculars and the kind of patience that only comes from decades of practice. Hank had spent 25 years as a cop, sitting surveillance in cars that smelled like stale coffee and regret. Clayton had done his time in the Army lying in foxholes for hours watching tree lines for movement that might be wind or might be death. Nothing moved, no headlights on the road, no sounds except the wind and the distant yip of coyotes, and the occasional scrabble of some small creature going about its nocturnal business. At 4 a.m., Earl and Virgil relieved them. Same positions, same silence, same nothing. Morning came in shades of pink and gold, and Nora emerged from her trailer at 6:30, dressed for work, moving carefully down the wooden steps on her prosthetic. She paused at the bottom and looked toward the ridge where she knew the bikers were watching, though she couldn't see them. She raised one hand, a small wave, and then drove to the diner in her Honda Civic. The second night was the same. Garrett and Randall took the first shift. The desert was cold after sunset, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in the space of an hour, and Garrett felt it in his joints in the old wound on his shoulder where shrapnel had lodged 35 years ago and never quite worked itself out. He pulled his leather jacket tighter and watched the trailer through binoculars and thought about Declan. His son had lived in a place like this toward the end. A small apartment in San Diego, walking distance from the base, but a world away from the life he'd been living before Afghanistan, before the IED that killed his best friend, before the nightmares that started and never stopped. Garrett had visited once, had stood in the doorway of that small apartment and seen the empty bottles and the unwashed dishes and the curtains drawn against the daylight, and had told himself it was just a phase, just adjustment. Declan would be fine. 3 months later, Declan was dead. The memory sat in Garrett's chest like a stone. He wondered if he was doing the right thing here or just trying to atone for a sin that no amount of good deeds could erase. He wondered if protecting Nora was about Nora at all, or if it was about the ghost of a 28-year-old Marine who'd needed his father and found only silence. It didn't matter. The why didn't matter. What mattered was the doing. Nothing happened that night either, or the next day. By the third evening, a dangerous complacency had begun to settle over the group. Maybe Crane had moved on. Maybe the badge flash and the threats had been enough. Maybe the man had found easier prey somewhere else and left Nora Shelby to her quiet life in her quiet trailer on the edge of the quiet desert. Virgil Knox did not believe this. Virgil was 61 years old and had survived 2 combat deployments overseas, 2 failed marriages, and a decade of alcoholism that had nearly killed him before a stint in rehab, and a Harley-Davidson and the brotherhood of the Hells Angels had given him something to live for. He was whipcord thin with eyes that missed nothing, a man who'd spent his life reading the invisible language of danger that most people never learned because most people had never needed to. He took the third night watch alone, perched on the ridge, with night vision binoculars and a thermos of black coffee and the bone-deep certainty that tonight would be different. He was right. He saw the vehicles at 1:47 a.m. Three SUVs, black no headlights moving fast across the hardpan from the east. They were running dark using the terrain to mask their approach, which meant they knew the area had scouted. It had planned this with the kind of operational precision that spoke to training and resources and serious intent. They stopped 200 yards from the trailer. Doors opened. Men poured out. Virgil counted through the binoculars, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline dumping into his bloodstream. 6 men, all in black, all carrying weapons. Rifles from the silhouettes, military grade, not handguns, not the tools of common criminals. These were the weapons of men who expected resistance and planned to overwhelm it. They moved in 2 teams, 3 toward the front of the trailer, 3 around the back. Standard breach formation. Whoever trained them had done it well. Virgil grabbed his radio. Contact, 6 hostiles, armed, moving on the trailer. Back up, now. Then he picked up his rifle and started down the ridge. Garrett was 8 minutes away. He'd been sleeping at the garage, fully clothed boots on the 1911 on the nightstand beside him. When the radio crackled, he was on his feet before the message finished. Decades of military training, compressing the gap between sleep and combat readiness into something that barely qualified as a heartbeat. He was on the Harley in 30 seconds. Earl and Hank roared to life beside him, engines screaming in the dark. 8 minutes. In a war, 8 minutes was a lifetime. Men lived and died in 8 minutes. Battles turned, cities fell. The entire course of human events could pivot on the fulcrum of 8 minutes. Virgil knew this. He also knew that he was 61 years old alone, outnumbered 6-1, and armed with a hunting rifle that held 5 rounds. The math was not in his favor. The math had never been in his favor, not in the wars he'd fought, not in the decades since. He'd stopped caring about math a long time ago. He reached the trailer's perimeter as the first team hit the front door. The sound, even from 50 yards away, was enormous. The door didn't just open, it exploded inward, cheap aluminum, tearing like paper under the impact of a battering ram. Shouting. Movement. The second team went through the back simultaneously. Virgil took position behind the rusted hull of an abandoned water tank 30 yards from the trailer and settled his rifle against the metal. Through the scope, he could see the back door hanging open, a rectangle of darkness. A figure emerged, one of the attackers backing out, scanning the perimeter. Virgil put a round into the dirt at the man's feet. The man flinched, dropped to a crouch, raised his weapon toward the water tank. Virgil fired again, this time close enough to shower the man with gravel. The man scrambled back inside. It wasn't much. It was enough. The attackers now knew they had a shooter outside, which meant they couldn't simply grab Nora and drive away. They'd have to deal with him first. And dealing with him would take time. Time that Nora needed. Time that the others needed to arrive. Inside the trailer, Nora felt the vibrations before she understood what was happening. She'd been sleeping or trying to. Sleep had become difficult since the incident at the diner. She kept the lights off, the curtains drawn, the front door locked, and barricaded with a chair for whatever good that would do against men with guns and battering rams. She'd taken to sleeping in her clothes shoes on prosthetic attached, ready to move at a moment's notice. The first vibration was the door breaking in. She felt it through the mattress, through the trailer's thin walls, a concussive shock that rattled the windows and sent the potted cactus on the ledge crashing to the floor. She was on her feet in seconds. Not because she'd heard the noise, but because her body understood the language of violence, even if her ears could not. Every nerve fired, every muscle tensed. The animal part of her brain, the part that predated language and hearing, and everything that made humans human, screamed a single word: run. But there was nowhere to run. The front door was gone. Shadows filled the hallway. The back door she could feel through the floorboards was also breached. She was trapped, cornered in her own bedroom, like an animal in a cage. She grabbed the only weapon she had, a cast-iron skillet that hung from a hook on the kitchen wall, the one Maggie had given her as a housewarming gift, with a wink and a joke about it being useful for more than cooking. It was heavy. It was solid. It was absurdly inadequate against men with rifles, but it was something, and something was better than nothing, and Nora Shelby was done being nothing. The first man came through the bedroom door, fast weapon up, expecting a cowering girl huddled in a corner. What he found instead was a 26-year-old woman with a prosthetic leg, in absolute fury in her eyes, swinging 9 pounds of cast iron directly at his face. The skillet connected with a sound she felt rather than heard, a vibration that traveled up her arms and into her shoulders, solid and satisfying. The man staggered backward, his nose erupting in blood, his weapon clattering off the wall. He fell against the door frame, and Nora hit him again, this time on the side of the head, and he went down. The second man was smarter, or at least more cautious. He came through the door sideways, weapon leading, and Nora couldn't reach him with the skillet before he had the barrel pointed at her chest. She froze. The skillet hung in her hand, heavy and useless. The man said something. She couldn't read his lips in the darkness. But his meaning was clear enough from the way he gestured with the gun. Drop it. She didn't drop it. Not because she was brave, though she was. Not because she had a plan, though she didn't. She didn't drop it because something inside her, some core of iron that matched the skillet in her hand, refused to surrender. She had been pushed down. She had been slapped. She had been told she was nothing, was broken, was less than human for 26 years, and she was finished. If this man was going to take her, he would have to take her fighting. He would have to earn it. The man raised his weapon. And then Virgil's bullet punched through the trailer wall 6 inches above his head. The man ducked. It was pure reflex, involuntary, the body's override of the mind's intent. And in that half second of distraction, Nora swung the skillet. She caught him on the wrist. The weapon flew from his hand, and she kicked it under the bed, a desperate, instinctive move that sent pain shooting up through her prosthetic socket, but put the gun out of reach. The man lunged for her. She brought the skillet down on his collarbone with everything she had and felt something give beneath the iron, felt the man's body go rigid with pain, heard nothing but felt the vibration of his scream through the trailer floor. He crumpled. Nora stepped over him and moved toward the back of the trailer. 2 men down, 4 to go. The skillet was slippery in her hands, blood or sweat or both, and her prosthetic was aching from the kick, the socket grinding against skin that was never meant to bear this kind of punishment. She reached the kitchen. 2 more men stood there, one by the broken front door, one by the shattered back. They saw her at the same time, this small woman with a cast iron skillet and murder in her eyes, and for just a moment, something that might have been doubt flickered across their faces. Then the night outside erupted. Garrett came through the darkness like a force of nature, the 1911 barking in his hand. The man at the back door went down, clutching his knee, screaming. Earl tackled the man at the front door with 300 pounds of momentum, driving him through the shattered door frame and into the dirt outside. Hank and Clayton and Randall arrived seconds later, the sound of Harleys cutting through the desert like war drums. Gunfire crackled. Voices shouted. The trailer shook with impacts that Nora felt but couldn't hear, a symphony of violence played on instruments she'd never been able to perceive. In the kitchen, Garrett found her. She stood amid the wreckage, skillet still raised, blood on her hands that wasn't hers. 2 unconscious men at her feet, and an expression on her face that Garrett recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 35 years. The look of someone who'd been to war and discovered they could survive it. He holstered his weapon, signed with hands that trembled with adrenaline and something else, something that felt like pride. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "You did this?" He gestured at the 2 men on the floor. She nodded, raised the skillet slightly as if to say, "I had help." Garrett almost laughed. Would have if the situation weren't still lethal. Instead, he signed, "Stay behind me. We're not finished." They moved through the trailer together, Garrett leading Nora a step behind her skillet, replaced now by the rifle she'd taken from one of the fallen men. She didn't know much about guns. Her brother had taught her to shoot years ago, enough to understand safety and stance and the basic mechanics of pulling a trigger. It would have to be enough. Outside, the situation was resolving. Earl had zip-tied 2 men. Clayton was sitting on a third, literally sitting on him, all 190 pounds of biker pinning the struggling attacker to the dirt. Randall, despite his wounded shoulder, had corralled the last 2 against the side of an SUV, his massive frame making escape impossible. 6 attackers, 6 neutralized. Virgil emerged from the darkness, rifle across his shoulders, looking like a ghost from a war that ended decades ago. "Everyone okay?" Garrett called. "Define okay," Randall said. "I think I re-injured my shoulder, again." One of the zip-tied men stirred, groaned, then spoke, his voice muffled by dirt and blood. "You're all dead, every one of you. Do you know who we work for?" Garrett walked over and crouched beside him. The man's face was a mess, nose broken, probably from Nora's skillet. Blood mixed with desert dust. I know exactly who you work for, Garrett said, and I know exactly what he does. What I don't know is why a man with an FBI badge is kidnapping women in the middle of the night. The man's eyes widened, then narrowed. He said nothing more. Hank was searching the others. He stopped at the second man, pulled something from his vest, and held it up in the floodlight of a bike headlight. A badge. FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special agent. Real Hank said, his voice flat, professional, the voice of a man who'd carried a badge himself for a quarter century. Properly issued. Current credentials. Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach. Check the others, he said. Hank checked. 3 of the 6 carried FBI credentials, all legitimate, all current. This changes things, Earl said quietly. Garrett looked at the men on the ground, then at Nora, who stood in the trailer doorway, clutching a rifle she barely knew how to use. Her face bruised, her hands bloody, her eyes asking a question she didn't need to sign. Now what? Now, Garrett said, we call the police, and we tell the truth. Hank shook his head slowly. Brother, we just assaulted federal agents. Even if they were here illegally, even if they were dirty, the badges are real. The law won't care about context. They'll see 6 bikers who attacked FBI personnel. That's 20 years minimum. I know, Garrett said. So we should run. No, we stay. We tell the truth. All of it. He looked at Nora again. She'd come down the steps, moved to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. She signed small and fierce, I'm not running either. Garrett put a hand on her shoulder and squeezed once. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Sheriff Burke arrived with 4 deputies in 22 minutes. Guns drawn, orders barked. The scene was controlled with the rough efficiency of law enforcement dealing with a situation they didn't fully understand and didn't much like. They separated the bikers, cuffed them, read them their rights. The 6 attackers were cuffed too, lined up against a patrol car, but even in handcuffs, one of them made a phone call. Garrett watched the man's face as he spoke, watched the slow smile that spread across bloody features. Help was coming. Crane's help. And Garrett realized with a sinking weight in his gut that he might have just made everything worse. They spent the night in the county jail, all 6 of them crammed into a holding cell that smelled like bleach and despair. Nobody slept. Earl paced. Hank sat in the corner with his head in his hands. Clayton and Randall played cards with a deck someone had left behind, moving stiffly, their wounds stiffening in the cold. Virgil sat beside Garrett on the narrow bench, silent thinking. You think she's okay? Virgil finally asked. I don't know, Garrett admitted. Maggie picked her up from the sheriff's office. She's safe. For now. For now, Virgil echoed. And when Crane sends more men, Garrett had no answer. Morning came with the sound of keys. A deputy led them down a hallway into a small interrogation room where Dalton Mercer was waiting. He looked older, grayer, the kind of tired that came from fighting battles you couldn't win. You stupid son of a bitch, Dalton said. Do you have any idea what you've done? Saved a woman's life. You shot 2 federal agents. They weren't federal agents. They were kidnappers with badges. Tell that to the judge. Dalton threw a folder on the table. Those badges are real, Garrett. Every one of them. FBI credentials properly issued, fully legitimate. The men you shot are special agents Garrett Morrison and Floyd Hendricks, both with 15 years of service. Both currently on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Garrett felt the ground shift beneath him. That's impossible. Is it Crane owns half the law enforcement in this state? You think he can't reach into the bureau? So we should have let them take her. I'm saying you just assaulted federal officers. I'm saying you're looking at 20 years, all of you. Dalton leaned forward. I can help you maybe, but you have to back off. Let us handle this. Like you've been handling it for 2 years. We're close. 1 more month, maybe 2. And how many women disappear in 2 months? That's not your problem. Garrett stood. You're wrong. It is my problem. Because I made it my problem. Then you're going to prison. So be it. They stared at each other across the table. 2 old soldiers who'd shared a war and lost touch with each other the way men lose touch with everything when grief gets heavy enough. You always were the most stubborn bastard I ever met, Dalton said finally. Fine, I'll do what I can. But if you keep pushing, I can't protect you. I'm not asking you to. Dalton gathered his folder. At the door he paused. Declan would want you to back off. You know that. He'd want his father alive. The words hit like shrapnel, but Garrett didn't flinch. Declan died because I wasn't there. I'm not making that mistake again. Dalton left. An hour later, a lawyer arrived. Expensive suit, predator eyes. He represented Crane Corp Holdings. His client was willing to drop all charges if the bikers left Arizona permanently. No, Garrett said. The lawyer blinked. Excuse me, tell Crane to come himself if he wants to threaten me. I don't negotiate with messengers. They were released on bail that afternoon. Maggie Rourke posted it, draining her savings, refusing arguments. You protected that girl, she said. That's worth every penny. Outside the sheriff's office, Nora was waiting. When she saw Garrett, she ran. Ran despite the prosthetic, despite the fear, despite everything. She threw her arms around him and buried her face in his chest. Everyone leaves, she signed against his shirt. Everyone always leaves, but you came back. Garrett held her, this young woman who'd fought off two armed men with a cast-iron skillet and then stood her ground while the world tried to break her. He made a promise he had no right to make. I'm not leaving, not until you're safe. That night, they gathered at the garage. All 6 bikers plus Maggie and Nora. Garrett spread maps across the workbench. Locations Earl had researched, routes, satellite images printed from a gas station internet terminal. Crane has a warehouse, he said, pointing, 15 miles from the Mexican border. Remote, heavily guarded. The FBI believes that's where he holds women before moving them across. You want to hit it, Earl said. It wasn't a question. I want to end this, permanently. That's suicide, Hank said. We don't know numbers. Security. Could be 20 guards, could be 50, probably closer to 20, Virgil said. Everyone turned. He shrugged. I did some reconnaissance, 3 perimeter patrols rotating shifts, 6 men per shift plus maybe 8 inside. 26 total. You scouted it, Garrett asked. Someone had to. Earl laughed, rocks tumbling in a barrel. Sneaky old bastard. We're all old, Randall pointed out. I got shot in the shoulder 2 nights ago. Clayton's got a concussion. Hank's ribs are cracked. We're not exactly in fighting shape. We don't need fighting shape, Garrett said. We need smart, fast, willing. Nora had been watching the conversation, reading lips where she could, following gestures where she couldn't. Now she raised her hand like a schoolgirl, and every man in the room turned to look at her. She signed, and Garrett translated aloud. She says she knows the layout, inside the warehouse. Crane showed her photographs 2 weeks ago when he cornered her at a gas station. Showed her where she'd be kept, where the other women were. He wanted to scare her. He wanted her to know what was coming. Garrett paused, watching Nora's hands. She says the basement has a specific layout, a central corridor with cells on both sides. She counted 12 doors in the photographs. A staircase at the north end, an emergency exit at the south end that she thinks leads to a loading dock. She stopped signing and looked around the room, meeting each man's eyes in turn. She says she's coming with you. She knows the inside. You need her. The garage went quiet. No, Garrett said. Absolutely not. Nora signed fiercely, her hands sharp and fast. You said I'm not bait, not a victim. You said I'm part of this? Did you mean it, or was that just something you said to make me feel better? Garrett stared at her. The room waited. I meant it. He signed. Then let me fight. I've spent my whole life being protected by people who weren't there when it mattered. My brother protected me. He died. The police were supposed to protect me. They laughed. You're protecting me now, and I'm grateful, but protection isn't enough anymore. I want to protect myself. I want to protect those other women. I want to walk into that place and be the person who opens those doors and tells them it's over. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. Let me do this. Please. The 6 men exchanged glances. These were men who'd seen combat, who understood the difference between courage and foolishness, who knew that wanting to fight and being able to fight were very different things. But they also saw what Garrett saw. A woman who'd taken down 2 armed men with a kitchen skillet. A woman who'd spent 26 years navigating a world that wasn't built for her and refused to be broken by it. A woman who was asking not to be saved, but to save. She rides with me, Garrett said finally. She stays behind us going in. But once we're inside, she leads us to the basement. She knows the layout. We don't. And there was something else. Something Nora had told Garrett earlier that day. something that had been nagging at him since the diner. Crane signed ASL, Garrett said. In the diner, crude but recognizable. That's not in any public record about him. No school transcripts, no known deaf family members, nothing. He learned it somewhere. He learned it from the women he took, Hank said quietly, the realization spreading across his weathered face. Exactly. He's been taking deaf women for years, long enough to pick up the language. That's evidence. Behavioral evidence that ties him directly to the trafficking operation. It's not enough for a conviction on its own, but combined with whatever we find in that warehouse, it could be the piece the FBI's been missing. Nora had given them that. The observation, the insight, the connection between Crane's crude signing and his victims. She wasn't just coming along for the ride. She was essential. When do we go? Earl asked. Garrett looked at Nora. Her expression hadn't changed. Resolute, determined, terrified, all three at once. Tonight, Garrett said, Crane will move fast now. He knows we're on to him. He'll either disappear or escalate. Either way, we're out of time. The afternoon passed in preparation. The garage became a war room. Maps and photograph drafts spread across every surface, weapons laid out on oil-stained cloths, the careful rituals of men who'd done this before in other lives, in other wars, and never thought they'd do it again. Garrett field stripped the 1911 for the second time that day, his hands moving with an efficiency that surprised even him. 35 years since he'd fired this weapon in combat. 35 years of cleaning it every morning, keeping it ready, waiting. He'd always wondered what he was waiting for. Now he knew. Earl checked ammunition, counting rounds with the methodical patience of a man who understood that in a firefight, every bullet was a decision. Virgil sharpened a hunting knife on a wet stone, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the garage like a metronome. Hank sat apart from the others, writing something on a piece of paper that he folded carefully and slipped into his vest pocket. A letter, probably. Cops always wrote letters before operations that might go wrong. Clayton tested his breaching charges, assembled from hardware store components and knowledge he'd acquired in a previous life. Randall packed a medical kit with the grim practicality of a man who expected to use it, bandages and tourniquets and morphine auto-injectors that he'd acquired through channels he didn't discuss. Nobody talked about what might happen. Nobody talked about dying. These were men who'd lived long enough to know that talking about death didn't prevent it, and worrying about it didn't help. You did the work. You prepared. You rode. At 6 o'clock, Garrett called Dalton. I need you to promise me something. What if something happens tonight? If I don't make it, I need you to make sure Nora is safe. Witness protection, new identity, whatever it takes. A long pause. Garrett, what are you planning? Promise me. I promise. Now tell me what you're doing. Something I should have done 35 years ago. Something I should have done for Declan. Standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. Don't do this. Let us handle it. You had your chance, Dalton. Now it's ours. He hung up before Dalton could respond. At 7:30, as the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, 6 Harleys fired their engines. The sound was thunder, was music, was a promise and a threat all at once. Nora stood by Garrett's bike, a borrowed leather jacket too large for her frame, a borrowed helmet in her hands. She looked at the 6 men, these aging warriors with their bad knees and worse memories, who were about to ride into danger for a girl they barely knew, and she felt something crack open inside her chest. Something that had been sealed shut since her brother died. Something she'd thought was dead. Hope. She signed to Garrett, "Come back. All of you, please come back." Garrett signed, "I promise." Then she climbed on behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and held on. They rode out in formation, 6 bikes against the dying light, heading south toward the border. Nora couldn't hear the engines, but she could feel them, a deep vibration that traveled through the frame of the motorcycle and into her bones, steady and powerful like a second heartbeat. She pressed her face against Garrett's back and watched the desert blur past in shades of gold and shadow. She thought about her brother who'd taught her to ride, who died on a road like this one. She thought about the women in Crane's warehouse, locked in cells waiting to be sold. She thought about the skillet in her hand and the way it had felt to fight back, to refuse to be taken, to discover that she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever believed. Behind her, the formation held steady, Earl's chopper growled on Garrett's right flank, the low note of its engine distinct from the others. Virgil rode the left, his leaner bike weaving slightly as he scanned the road ahead and behind, watching for tails, for headlights that appeared and stayed too long. Hank and Clayton and Randall brought up the rear, three abreast, a wall of chrome and leather, and the kind of determination that comes from men who've already decided they have nothing left to lose. The desert stretched ahead, vast and empty and indifferent to the small dramas of human courage and human cruelty that played out across its surface. They passed abandoned gas stations and shuttered motels, the bones of Route 66's Golden Age monuments, to a time when the open road meant something different than it did now. They passed a coyote standing on a ridge, watching them with yellow eyes that reflected the last light. They passed a family in a minivan, children's faces pressed against the windows, staring at the bikers, with the wide-eyed wonder that motorcycles still inspired in the young. Nora watched the children and thought, I'm doing this for you, for the girls you'll grow up to be, so that no one ever puts you in a cage and tells you that you're merchandise. The sun touched the horizon and vanished. The sky bled from orange to purple to black. The temperature dropped. The desert cold settled in, sharp and sudden, and Nora pressed closer to Garrett's back for warmth. 50 miles south of Flagstaff, they turned off the highway onto a dirt road that wound through scrubland and mesquite. The bike slowed, headlights cut through gathering darkness. And ahead, barely visible against the black line of the horizon, a faint glow. The warehouse. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, a warehouse full of imprisoned women waited for a rescue that was coming on the backs of 6 motorcycles, in the stubborn, reckless, beautiful refusal of 7 people to accept that the world couldn't be changed. The warehouse revealed itself in pieces as they approached from the west, using the terrain the way Virgil had mapped it, ridgelines and dry washes, and the natural folds of desert that hid movement from anyone not specifically watching for it. First, the lights. Floodlights mounted on 30-foot poles, turning the desert floor around the compound into artificial daylight, harsh white pools separated by corridors of shadow. Then the fence. Chain link topped with razor wire glinting like teeth in the glare. Then the building itself, squat and brutal concrete and corrugated steel. The kind of structure designed for function rather than form. It looked like what it was, a place where things were stored, where inventory was kept. Garrett watched through binoculars from a ridge a quarter-mile out. Nora pressed against the ground beside him, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the compound with an intensity that had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with focus. 3 perimeter teams, Virgil whispered from his other side. 6-minute rotation cycle. Cameras on the corners, motion sensors along the fence line. 2 guards at the main gate. Rest inside. How many inside? At least 8, maybe more in the basement level. Garrett lowered the binoculars and looked at his team. 6 old men and 1 young woman lying in the dirt on a desert ridge, armed with weapons that felt both familiar and foreign after years of peace. Earl's face was calm the way it always was before action, a stillness that belied the violence he was capable of. Hank's jaw was set, his cop instincts warring with his biker instincts, both telling him this was insane. Clayton was checking his breaching charge for the 3rd time, his hands trembling slightly, age and arthritis and fear, all 3 probably. Randall flexed his wounded shoulder and winced. Virgil was already calculating angles, distances, timing the mathematics of survival that he'd learned in wars fought long ago. This is still suicide, Hank said quietly. 6 of us against 20 plus. 7, Nora signed. Garrett didn't translate. He didn't need to. She held up 7 fingers and pointed to herself, and even Hank, who didn't know sign language, understood. Our reflexes aren't what they were, Hank continued. Our aim isn't what it was. Then we make up for it with experience, Garrett said. We've lived long enough to know how to survive. That counts for something. Does it, Earl asked, or are we just old fools about to get killed playing hero? Garrett thought about that, about Declan, about Henderson, about all the times he'd failed. Maybe we are, he said, but we're old fools who remember what it means to stand up. That's got to count for something. Nobody argued. Nobody left. At midnight, they moved. Clayton went first, crawling through darkness with wire cutters and decades of demolition training. The fence parted under his hands, and they slipped through, one at a time, low and fast, using the shadow corridors between floodlights. Garrett's knees screamed. His back protested. He ignored both. Pain was information. You chose what to do with it. The first guard never saw Virgil coming. The old man moved like smoke, silent and inevitable, and the guard dropped without a sound. Zip ties. Duct tape. One down. They made it halfway to the main building before the alarm went off. Garrett never knew what triggered it. A camera angle they'd miscalculated. A patrol rotation off by 30 seconds. Plain bad luck. It didn't matter. What mattered was the sudden wail of sirens, the floodlights blazing brighter, the sound of running boots and shouted orders. Contact, Hank yelled, and the night exploded. Muzzle flashes lit the compound like strobe lights. Bullets cracked through desert air. Garrett hit the ground behind a concrete barrier and returned fire, 3 controlled shots at shapes moving in the glare. One went down, others scattered. Earl fired methodically from his left face, calm despite the chaos. Virgil had found cover behind a shipping container and was picking off guards with the patience of a man who'd learned marksmanship before most of these young thugs were born. Clayton lobbed smoke grenades, white clouds billowing across the compound, turning the battlefield into a shifting maze of visibility and blindness. Move, Garrett shouted, and they advanced through the smoke, weapons up, senses screaming. A guard stumbled out of the white wall, coughing, rifle loose. Hank hit him with a right hook backed by 60 years of living. The man dropped. Randall took a position at the compound's east wall, his bulk blocking the corridor, his wounded arm hanging, but his good arm steady on his weapon. The main door was reinforced. Steel core, the kind of door designed to keep people in. Clayton stepped up with the breaching charge. Fire in the hole. They fell back. The charge detonated with a sound that seemed to crack the desert itself, and the door sagged inward, twisted metal and concrete dust. Garrett went through first, because that was what leaders did. Into a hallway lit by emergency lights that painted everything the color of blood. A guard appeared, fired wild. Garrett returned 2 rounds center mass muscle memory from 35 years ago, executing with mechanical precision. The man went down. Clear left, Earl called. Clearer right from Virgil. They moved deeper, clearing rooms, storage, offices, a break room with half-finished coffee, and a television playing to an empty chair. The ordinary detritus of men who did monstrous things and then sat down for a cup of coffee afterward. Then they found the stairs. Garrett stopped at the tape and looked back at Nora. She'd stayed behind them, coming in as promised. Moving quietly on her prosthetic, the rifle she'd taken from the trailer clutched in her hands. She hadn't fired it, hadn't needed to, but she was here, and her eyes were clear, and when Garrett signed going down, now stay close, she nodded once and moved to his shoulder. The basement level was different, colder, darker. Emergency lights spaced farther apart, creating pools of shadow that could hide anything. The air smelled wrong, sweat and fear and something chemical. Nora took the lead. She moved with certainty, following the layout she'd memorized from the photographs Crane had shown her to terrorize her. Left at the bottom of the stairs, through a fire door, into a central corridor that stretched ahead, lined on both sides with heavy doors. Small windows, prison doors. Garrett looked through the first window and his heart stopped. A young woman stared back at him, maybe 20, bruised, terrified. Behind her, 2 more women huddled in the corner of a cell no larger than 8 feet square, furnished with nothing but a bucket and 2 thin mattresses. "Open it," Garrett said. Earl shot the lock. The door swung open. The women scrambled backward away from these armed strangers who'd blown their way in. Nora stepped forward. She holstered the rifle across her back, raised both hands, palms out. "Universal. I'm not a threat." Then she signed slow and clear, and one of the women's eyes went wide. She signed back, frantic, disbelieving. Nora signed again, and the woman started to cry. She's deaf, Garrett realized. The woman in the cell was deaf. Nora turned to him. Her face was composed, but her eyes burned. "She says there are more. All along this hallway. Some are deaf. Some have other disabilities. She says they've been here for weeks. She says men come and take 1 or 2 at a time and they never come back." "Get them out," Garrett said. "All of them." They went door by door. Earl and Hank shooting locks. Garrett and Virgil providing cover. Clayton and Randall helping women to their feet, supporting those who couldn't walk, carrying those who couldn't stand. And Nora. Nora was everywhere, signing to the deaf women, touching the shoulders of the frightened ones, guiding the disoriented, translating, reassuring. Being the first face of freedom that these women saw, and making sure that face was calm and strong and unafraid even though she was terrified, even though her hands shook between signs, even though every cell they opened revealed fresh horrors that would haunt her for years. One woman had only one arm. Another was in a wheelchair, a battered, rusted thing with a broken wheel. A third wore leg braces, ancient ones medical equipment from a decade ago barely functional. A fourth was blind, her eyes milky, her hands reaching out for contact for proof that the voices and the hands helping her were real and not another cruel dream. 14 women. 14 lives that Dominic Crane had decided were worth less than the price he could get for them. Nora counted them, touched each one, memorized each face. These were her people. Not because they shared a disability, though some did, but because they shared an experience. The experience of being invisible, of being merchandise. Weapons that cost more than cars. He was smiling. Well, well, the geriatric rescue squad. I have to admit, I'm impressed you made it this far. Garrett raised his pistol. It's over, Crane. FBI's on the way. You're done, am I? The smile widened. Here's the thing about being rich and connected, old man. The FBI won't get here for another 20 minutes. That's plenty of time to clean up this mess. Plenty of time to make sure you and your biker buddies have a tragic accident. He looked past Garrett at the women clustered near the stairs. His eyes found Nora. His smile changed, became something personal, something possessive. And there she is, my favorite, the one who got away. He signed at her, crude and slow, not for long. Nora didn't flinch. She signed back one word, a word that needed no translation, a word that every person in that corridor understood regardless of language or hearing. The sign was sharp, definitive, final. No, Crane's smile flickered. Kill them, he said to his men, but keep the cripples alive. Their inventory. The tactical team raised their weapons. Earl shot the overhead sprinkler system. Water exploded from broken pipes, a deluge that turned the corridor into chaos. Visibility dropped to nothing. The tactical team's night vision goggles, designed for darkness, flared and whited out in the sudden combination of water and flashlight beams. For 5 seconds, nobody could see anything. 5 seconds was enough. Garrett fired blind through the spray. Saw one of Crane's men stagger. Virgil grabbed 2 of the women, pulled them behind the cover of an open cell door. Hank returned fire precise despite the water streaming into his eyes. Clayton shoved 3 women toward the stairs, putting his body between them and the gunfire. And Nora moved. She moved through the water in the chaos with the certainty of someone operating in her native element. Silence had always been her world. Darkness and confusion and the absence of reliable sensory input were conditions she'd navigated every day of her life. While the hearing men around her were disoriented by the noise in the water and the screaming, Nora was calm. Nora was focused. Nora was reading the vibrations through the floor, the movement of air, the flicker of muzzle flashes, processing information through channels that the other combatants didn't even know existed. She reached the cluster of women near the stairs, signed rapid instructions. Move. Up. Now. Go. And they moved because she was one of them, because she spoke their language, because when a deaf woman with a prosthetic leg and blood on her hands tells you to run, you run. In the corridor, Crane broke for the far door. Garrett saw him through a gap in the water curtain, a shadow retreating into shadow, and gave chase. Go! Earl shouted. We've got this. Garrett ran. His boots slipped on wet concrete. His lungs burned. His knees howled. 64 years of hard living compressed into every stride, every joint, protesting every muscle, remembering a younger body that no longer existed. Crane was fast, 42 years old and gym fit and running on the adrenaline of a cornered animal. He burst through the far door and Garrett followed, found himself in a storage room. Metal shelving, plastic crates, one entrance, no exits, a dead end. Crane stood in the center of the room, no longer smiling. He held a pistol in one hand and a cell phone in the other. Water dripped from his suit, blood from a cut on his forehead. You should have taken the deal, he said. Should have walked away when you had the chance. Couldn't do that? Garrett replied. His weapon was steady despite his racing heart. I've walked away too many times in my life. Not this time. Noble. Stupid. But noble. Crane glanced at his phone. I just sent a text. 5 words. Activate contingency. Eliminate all witnesses. What does that mean? It means the girl. Nora. The waitress. I've had men watching wherever she's been hiding. By now, they've broken in. By now, she's dead. The words hit like a physical blow. Garrett's vision tunneled. Nora, Declan. The names blurred, the faces blurred. His son's face, Henderson's face. Every face he'd ever failed to protect. You're lying. Am I? Check your phone. I'll wait. With his free hand, Garrett pulled his phone from his pocket. 3 missed calls from Maggie. 2 from Dalton. 1 text from an unknown number. A photo. Nora on the floor, blood pooling beneath her head, eyes open, empty. The phone slipped from Garrett's fingers and hit the wet concrete. That's what happens, Crane said softly, when old men play hero. People die. The people you're trying to protect, the people you love. Everyone dies except you, and you get to live with that. How's that feel, Grandpa? How's it feel to fail again? Something broke inside Garrett. Some last wall. Some final barrier between the man he'd tried to be for 64 years and the soldier he'd buried in the desert 3.5 decades ago. He thought of Henderson burning, of Declan alone with a gun, of every failure, every loss, every promise broken. He raised the 1911, and then he felt footsteps behind him. Not heard exactly. Felt them, through the floor, through the water, through the primal awareness that comes from being attuned to vibrations rather than sounds. Nora Shelby stepped into the storage room. She was soaking wet. Her prosthetic legs squeaked against the concrete. Blood on her hands, none of it hers. The borrowed leather jacket hung from her shoulders like armor. And she was alive. Alive and breathing and standing upright and looking at Dominic Crane with an expression that contained no fear at all. She raised her hands and signed directly at Crane, knowing he could understand, knowing he'd learned her language from the women he'd stolen. I'm still here. Your men failed. Your photo was fake. And I'm the one who got all 14 women out while you were running. You spent 3 years hunting women like me. Women you thought were weak. Women you thought wouldn't fight back. You were wrong, Crane stared at her. His composure cracked. The phone in his hand lowered. For the first time since Garrett had encountered him in the diner, Dominic Crane looked uncertain. Garrett felt the world realign. The photo was fake, photoshopped, a manipulation designed to break him, designed to make him give up or make a mistake. And it had almost worked. It had come within a heartbeat of working. But Nora was here. Nora was alive. And Nora was the one who'd come to save him from the lie the way he'd come to save her from the truth. He shot Crane in the kneecap. The younger man screamed, dropped his phone, fired wild. His bullet went wide. Garrett's second shot hit Crane's shoulder, spinning him around. He collapsed against the shelving, gasping, his weapon clattering across the wet floor. Garrett walked forward. His pistol never wavered. You built an empire on invisible women, he said. Women the world threw away. Women nobody would miss. But you made a mistake. You went after her. And she wasn't invisible. She was the most visible person I've ever met, because she refused to disappear. He stood over Crane, looking down at this predator who turned human beings into merchandise. It would be easy. One trigger pull. Justice delivered in the language that men like Crane understood best. Declan's voice in his memory. The last voicemail, the one Garrett had listened to 1,000 times, the one that still lived on his phone like a ghost in the machine. Dad, you always told me the hardest thing is knowing when to pull the trigger and when to walk away. Garrett lowered the gun. You're not worth it, he said. You're not worth becoming a killer for. You're going to rot in a cell for the rest of your life, and every morning you're going to wake up and remember that a deaf girl with one leg and a cast iron skillet brought your whole empire down. Earl appeared in the doorway, soaking wet, blood from a cut on his forehead. Grinning, everyone accounted for. Women are safe, guards zip-tied. Hank's on the phone with the FBI. We won, brother. He saw Crane bleeding on the floor. You going to finish him number prison for the rest of his life? Earl nodded. Then gently I saw the photo on your phone. It's fake, Garrett. Dalton figured it out. Crane sent it to break you. I know, Garrett said. He looked at Nora standing in the doorway, still signing to a group of women who'd followed her down the corridor, still guiding, still protecting, even now, she told me. The FBI arrived 14 minutes later. Dalton Mercer in the lead, flanked by agents in tactical gear. The real kind, the legitimate kind, The ones who'd been chasing Crane for 2 years and arrived to find the job done by 6 senior citizens and a 26-year-old waitress. Dalton surveyed the scene. The neutralized guards, the rescued women, the bleeding crime lord on the floor, the 6 battered bikers, and Nora Shelby, who stood among the freed women like a shepherd among her flock, signing, translating, comforting, refusing to stop working, even though her hands were shaking and her prosthetic socket was rubbing her leg raw and she hadn't slept in 36 hours. You stupid, reckless, brave sons of bitches, Dalton said. You actually pulled it off. We pulled it off, Garrett corrected. All of us. His eyes found Nora across the room. She looked up. Their gazes met, and she signed across the distance through the chaos and the aftermath and the slowly settling dust of everything they'd been through. Thank you. For believing me, for letting me fight. Garrett signed back. You didn't need permission. You never did. The ride back to Flagstaff was slow. They took the highway at half speed, exhausted, wounded, processing what they'd done and what it had cost. Clayton had a bullet graze across his ribs that Randall had stitched with a curved needle and dental floss in the parking lot of the warehouse, cursing steadily while Clayton bit down on a leather strap and tried not to scream. Randall's shoulder was bleeding again, the wound from the trailer raid reopened and swelling badly. Earl had a concussion from where a guard had clubbed him with a rifle butt, and he kept drifting to the left on his bike until Hank rode close enough to steady him with a hand on his arm. Hank's knee had twisted during the breach, swollen now to twice its normal size, making every gear shift in exercise and controlled agony. Virgil had burns on his hands from a hot barrel, the skin blistered and weeping. They were a mess, a beaten, battered, bleeding mess of old men who had no business being alive. And they'd won. Dawn was breaking when they pulled into Maggie's parking lot. The diner was lit up like Christmas, every light blazing, the neon sign glowing pink and blue against the pale morning sky. Through the windows, Garrett could see people moving inside. Maggie, Dalton, other faces he didn't recognize, and Nora. She stood in the doorway. When she saw the bikes, she ran. Ran despite her prosthetic leg, ran despite the exhaustion, ran despite the fear she must have carried all night like a stone in her chest. She ran the way people run toward the thing they're most afraid of losing, desperate and graceless and beautiful in its urgency. Garrett barely got his leg over the bike before she reached him. She threw herself into his arms and he caught her, held her while she sobbed against his chest, her whole body shaking with relief and joy and the kind of emotion that has no name because language was never designed to contain it. I thought you were dead, she signed. When she finally pulled back enough to see his hands, I saw the photo. Dalton called and told me it was fake, but I couldn't believe him until I saw you. I couldn't breathe until I saw you. I'm here, Gwentred, son. We're all here, bah. She pulled back further, looked at him. This man who'd walked into a diner 3 days ago and changed the trajectory of her entire life. This stranger who'd spoken her language. This soldier who'd fought a war he was too old to fight because a 26-year-old waitress had reminded him of a son he'd lost. You came back, she signed. You promised. And you came back. I'll always come back, Garrett signed. That's what fathers do. Nora's eyes widened. The word hung between them. Father. If you want Garrett signed, if that's okay with you. She didn't sign a response. She just wrapped her arms around him and held on like she'd never let go. And Garrett held her back, this daughter he'd found at the end of a road he'd never expected to travel, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, not exactly. Healing was too clean a word for what was happening. It was more like a bone resetting. Painful. Necessary. The beginning of something that might, given enough time and enough grace, become whole. 3 months later, Garrett Howland stood in a courtroom and listened to a judge sentence Dominic Crane to 47 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The gallery was packed. Rescued women, their families, law enforcement, media, and in the front row, Nora Shelby, who testified for 2 hours, her hands steady, a court interpreter translating her signs into spoken words that held the courtroom in absolute silence. She'd told them everything. The stalking, the attack in the diner, the midnight raid on her trailer, the warehouse, the cells, the women. She'd told them about the skillet in the darkness in the moment she'd walked into that storage room and shown Crane that the woman he'd tried to erase was still standing. She'd told them about the women she'd found in those cells, their faces, their injuries, the way the deaf ones had signed, "Help me," help me, with hands that had forgotten how to hope. The prosecution had also presented Nora's observation about Crane's ASL knowledge, the detail that had cracked the case open. Linguistic experts testified that Crane's signing patterns matched the regional dialects of deaf communities in 3 states where women had disappeared. It was the behavioral evidence the FBI had been missing for 2 years, the thread that connected Crane directly to his victims, and it had come from a 26-year-old waitress who'd noticed what trained agents had overlooked. Crane's network unraveled in the weeks that followed. He gave up everyone: 3 state senators who'd taken his money, 2 federal judges who'd buried evidence, police chiefs, border patrol agents, FBI personnel who'd sold their badges for cash. Dalton Mercer oversaw the operation personally, and by the time the indictments were finished, 47 people faced federal charges in what the media called the largest corruption case in Arizona history. When the sentence was read, Nora took Garrett's hand. Justice, she signed. Justice, he agreed. But justice was just the beginning. The real work was what came after: the healing, the rebuilding, the slow process of learning to trust again. Nora started therapy working with a counselor who specialized in trauma and who learned basic ASL so they could communicate without an interpreter. Garrett started therapy too for the first time in his life because Nora had looked at him one evening over dinner and signed "You saved me." Who's going to save you? He hadn't had an answer. So he'd found a therapist, a retired military psychologist in Flagstaff who'd worked with veterans for 30 years and didn't flinch at anything Garrett told him. Not Kuwait, not Henderson, not Declan, not the nightmares that still came every third night like clockwork. The therapist didn't fix him. Nobody could fix him. But he gave Garrett something he'd never had before: permission to grieve without guilt. Permission to forgive himself for being human. 6 months after the trial, Garrett stood in Maggie's diner and watched Nora work the counter. She moved with confidence now. Her prostheticing was no longer something to hide, but simply part of who she was. She laughed with customers. She signed with the deaf teenager she'd hired for weekends, a kid named Marcus who reminded her of her brother. She belonged in a way she'd never belonged anywhere before. Maggie had made her a partner. 50% ownership, legal and official. "You earned it," the old woman said, "and I need someone to take over when these old bones give out." On the wall behind the counter hung a photograph: 6 bikers in leather vests standing in front of their Harleys, arms crossed. Beneath it, a plaque: "Our Guardians." Earl walked and spotted Garrett in his usual booth. "Thought I'd find you here. Where else would I be?" "Good point." Earl slid into the opposite seat. "Got news. Remember that organization, Angels Guardians?" After the trial, the bikers had established a nonprofit: protection and support for vulnerable women, shelters, job training, legal aid, funded by donations and ironically by assets seized from Crane's empire. What about it? 50 chapters in 20 states now. Hundreds of bikers signed up. Turns out there's a lot of old guys like us who want to make a difference. Earl grinned. "We're going nationwide, brother." Garrett thought about that, about all the Noras out there, all the invisible women in invisible cages waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care. "Good," he said. Nora brought coffee without being asked, set it down with a smile that reached her eyes, that lit her whole face, that made Garrett's chest ache with a feeling he'd thought he'd never experience again. "She signed dinner tonight. My place. I'm making that chicken recipe Maggie taught me." Over the past months, they'd settled into a rhythm: Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations. The small domestic rituals that accumulated over time became the architecture of family. "I'll be there," Garrett signed. She smiled again and went back to work, and Garrett watched her go. This young woman who'd walked into a warehouse full of armed men and walked out with 14 lives saved, who'd stared down a monster and refused to blink, who'd taught him that strength wasn't about muscles or weapons or the ability to absorb punishment, but about the willingness to stand up when everything in you screamed to stay down. Later that afternoon, he rode out to the veterans cemetery. He made this trip once a month, always alone, always at sunset when the desert light turned everything gold. The road to the cemetery was a 2-lane highway that wound through terrain so beautiful it hurt red rock formations and towering saguaros, and sky so vast it made a man feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. Garrett rode slowly, letting the Harleys rumble fill the silence, letting the wind pull at his vest, letting the landscape do what it always did. Remind him that the world was bigger than his grief. The cemetery was quiet. It was always quiet here, though not the oppressive silence of his cabin. This silence had dignity, purpose. The rows of white headstones stretched across the dry ground in perfect formation, soldiers at attention even in death. American flags marked each grave, small ones faded by sun and wind, but still flying, still claiming territory for the men and women who'd earned their place here. Garrett parked at the edge of the road and walked the familiar path. He knew the route by heart. 23 rows in, 14 stones from the left. A simple white marker identical to every other marker in the cemetery, because in death, if not in life, every soldier was equal. Declan Howland, 1st Lieutenant United States Marine Corps, born 1992, died 2020. 28 years. Garrett knelt. His knees protested as they always did, and he ignored them as he always did. He placed flowers on the stone desert wildflowers he'd picked along the road, purple and yellow and orange, the colors of the Arizona sunset that Declan had loved as a boy. "I did it, son," he said quietly. "I stood up when it mattered. I saved someone who needed saving. I wish it could have been you. God, I wish it could have been you. But I think you'd be proud anyway." The desert wind stirred warm and gentle, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I found a daughter," he continued, "not to replace you. Nobody could replace you. But to give me a reason to keep going. She calls me Dad now, in sign language. Every time she does, it breaks my heart and puts it back together at the same time." He sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun descend. "I'm 66 now. Don't know how many years I've got left, but I'm going to use them right. I'm going to be the man you needed me to be, the man I should have been all along." He placed one hand on the headstone, warm stone under weathered fingers. "I love you, son, and I'm sorry for not being there, for not understanding, for all the ways I failed you." The wind whispered through the cemetery. Flags rustled, flowers stirred. "But I'm here now," Garrett said, "and I'm not running anymore." He stood, walked back to his Harley. The bike started with its familiar rumble, a sound that meant home and freedom and the open road. He rode slowly through the cemetery gates, then opened the throttle. The engine roared. The speedometer climbed. The desert blurred past in shades of gold and deepening blue. He thought about the life he'd lived, the mistakes, the regrets, the people lost and the people saved. The wars fought foreign and domestic. The long road that had led him here, still alive, despite everything still fighting, despite every reason to quit. He thought about Nora waiting for him with dinner and stories about her day, about the deaf teenager she was mentoring, about the grant she'd applied for to make the diner fully accessible, about the way she'd started volunteering at the women's shelter on weekends, sitting with frightened women, the way the bikers had once sat with her signing, "I believe you and you're not alone, and you matter," to women who'd forgotten those things were true. He thought about Earl and the boys planning their next mission, about Virgil teaching self-defense classes at the community center, about Randall, despite his busted shoulder, driving 3 hours every week to volunteer at the VA hospital, about Hank coaching a youth boxing program in Flagstaff, about Clayton, the youngest at 52, who'd enrolled in community college because he said if Nora could fight off 2 armed men with a skillet, he could probably handle freshman English. He thought about Declan and Henderson and all the ghosts that rode with him. And he thought about the future stretching ahead like the highway, uncertain and challenging and full of possibility. They'd asked him once at the Angels Guardians launch event what it meant to be a hero. He'd shaken his head. "I'm no hero," he'd said. "Heroes don't fail as much as I have. Heroes don't carry as many regrets. But I've learned something in 66 years. It's not about never falling. It's about getting back up every single time, even when you're tired, even when you're old, and even when the smart thing would be to stay down. You get up, you stand, you fight for the people who can't fight for themselves. That's not heroism, that's just being human. Being the kind of human we're all supposed to be." The road stretched ahead, the desert darkened. Stars appeared scattered across the sky like the broken glass on Maggie's diner floor the day everything started. Garrett Howland rode toward the lights of Flagstaff, toward home, toward a daughter who waited with dinner and stories and the quiet miracle of a life rebuilt from wreckage. Behind him, the cemetery faded into shadow. Ahead, the lights shimmered like promises kept. And somewhere between the past and the future, between regret and redemption, an old biker found peace. Not perfect peace, not the kind without scars, but the peace that comes from knowing you did the right thing when it mattered most. Even when it cost everything, that was enough. That would always be enough.